This paper begins where the last one left off, with environmental destruction and Ernst Laszlo, but mostly the introduction of the notion of Nous and creating a global noosphere, and then the connection between a study of ancient Greek civilization and their desire to create an international noosphere, and then our desire to do so today. It's called All Human Beings by Nature Seek Understanding, Creating a Global Noosphere in Today's Era of Globalization. The goal of this paper is to build bridges between ancient wisdom literature and the work of contemporary scholars, intellectuals, and professionals in many fields. Whether these authors use the word nous or not to refer to the highest power of the human soul and the ultimate power of the universe, I will show that their views converge on the existence of such a power. Systems scientists have come to the conclusion that all processes at the micro level, the level of living things, and the level of human culture follow the same pattern of development. Quote, in evolution there's a progression from multiplicity and chaos to oneness and order. Social systems, like systems in nature, form holyarchies. Evolution appears to drive toward the superposition of system upon system in a continuous multi-level structure, traversing the regions of the suborganic, the organic, and the supraorganic. Unquote. The key element in the formation of human society is a power of the human soul, the power of what system scientists call reflective consciousness, located in the cerebral cortex. When active, a person possesses the, quote, ability not only to perceive and feel things, but to know that one perceives and feels them, and hence to order them in the light of one's purposes, unquote. Through the use of language and envisioning a future, we have the power to make a life plan and to follow our ideas. Some life plans are better than others because they are most likely to lead to human fulfillment. Quote, fulfillment means the realization of human potentials for existence as a biological and as a socio-cultural being. It means bodily as well as mental health. Our humanistic goal is to enhance individual fulfillment in an increasingly deterministic, multi-leveled society. System scientists are not moral relativists. They have discovered that, quote, humanistic norms are not arbitrary. They are encoded in every natural system, unquote. Laszlo does not assume that religion has to be antithetical to science. Rather, he argues that, quote, the rational discoveries of science need to be complemented by effective, basically spiritual insight. There's a significant humanistic and ecumenical component in every great religion. Laszlo defines this development as the formation of a noosphere, taken from the Greek word for mind, nous. He calls upon the world's religions to, quote, celebrate the evolution of the noosphere in Earth as the next and especially significant phase in the world's evolutionary self-creation. They could help us recognize that our journey as individuals within the Earth's bio-noosphere reflects the evolutionary journey of the cosmos, that the self-creating universe is our larger self, our primary sacred community. My own work shows how the history and culture of the ancient Greeks can be understood as a long process of social evolution that culminated in the self-conscious awareness of the power of nous in the human psyche, and as the first principle of being. The mythological stories in epic poetry and tragedy aim to awaken people to the power of nous in their souls and to motivate them to use that power in all aspects of their lives. The method of Greek education, paideia, shows people the disastrous consequences for everyone when people are motivated by pleasure, wealth, power, revenge, or other irrational goals. These desires should be flushed out of the psyche and replaced by nous as the natural power that drives a human soul. The pantheon of Olympian gods can be interpreted to symbolize a number of authentically spiritual aspirations in every human life. There are male and female archetypes of the ways human beings seek to live for the sake of something greater than themselves. Having children, leaving a legacy that benefits future generations, creating literary texts that pass on moral teachings to promote future well-being, scientific discoveries and their applications to technologies that promote human flourishing, a just political order, the creation of social and political institutions that promote human welfare, a history of acting in ways that create a high quality of social life, a history of honoring those who promote social and political well-being and provide models for the next generation, stories of individuals whose choices promoted human flourishing, the creation of beautiful music, dance, poetry, sculpture, architecture, and all other aspects of a flourishing society. The stories of Greek myths, epic poetry, and tragedy show the symbolic connection between the passions and relationships among the gods and the creation of human history by human agents. All of these texts cultivate the power of reflective self-consciousness by showing characters who are consciously aware of their motives and who give extensive reasons for making the choices they make, even when those choices are mistaken. Observing the reasoning process, the choices, and the consequences of these choices heightens the self-conscious awareness of audience members. It encourages them to live more examined lives, to develop better ideas about the good life for themselves and others. Sophocles' play, Philoctetes, is just one example of the way Greek texts aim to educate Nous. The play has three main characters. Neoptolemus experiences an archetypal coming-of-age experience. He begins the play trusting in the integrity and good judgment of his elders. By the end of the play, he recognizes that they are both wrong, tells them they are wrong, and tells them what they should choose. Odysseus, the middle-aged man, abuses his power in the name of the end justifying the means, by misinterpreting his goals, by asking a young man to lie to and abuse a helpless old man, and by telling the young man he will be accepted into society and given respect if and only if he will do something immoral. Philoctetes, an old man, allows his history of personal suffering to make him so bitter and vengeful that he's unable to accept the opportunity to be a hero and to return to his homeland and live out his days happily. Plato goes further in the recognition and education of Nous. Socrates explicitly says that the system of education in Republic 6 and 7 is designed to educate Nous. He claims that Nous is a natural power of the human soul, that it is the highest power, that it is easily corrupted, and that in order to be healthy, human beings must exercise Nous in all of their practical choices, and understand the theoretical foundations of human life. My own work has been dedicated to showing how all of Plato's dialogues together are part of Plato's educational system for educating Nous. Like tragedy, each dialogue is named after a person who expresses an irrational opinion that is an obstacle to the exercise of Nous. Each dialogue aims to remove that opinion so that Nous can work freely and see and choose what is best in the type of situation described. Plato's dialogues implicitly show the many, many ways ancient Greek culture developed over time, leading more and more toward a society that promoted the cultivation of the souls of as many citizens as possible to the highest level possible. Olympia, Delphi, the Eleusinian Fields, Epidaurus, the Parthenon, the Theater of Dionysus, the assembly, trial by jury, the agora, marketplace, where citizens were informed about the decisions being made in the assembly and about the jury trials being held, where there were public spaces for citizens to debate public affairs, where citizens were encouraged to have a private symposia in their home to discuss public affairs, etc. Plato's dialogues also show how the Athenians abused their system until it ultimately collapsed. Plato started his academy and passed down his dialogues in order to educate future generations. The story of Athens is the archetypal story of the cultivation and eventual loss of political engagement, artistic freedom, and uncensored intellectual curiosity, the highest human achievements. Aristotle's virtues and vices and his view of political association as described in his Ethics and Politics are easily applicable to the characters in Greek myth, Homer, tragedy, and Plato's dialogues. Aristotle describes all the moral and intellectual powers of soul and defines human flourishing as the complete exercise of mind, practical and theoretical. The literary texts focus on the exercise of practical mind, which is the power that enables an individual to recognize and to choose the best option in any given situation. Practical mind is incarnational, lived out in the motions and behaviors of the body, united with the appropriate emotions and reasons. Finally, Aristotle's work explains the universe and leads to the conclusion that there exists a first principle, divine Nous, which underlies the nature of being as such. The universe moves toward higher and higher levels of complexity, hence of being, hence higher and higher levels of good. Theoretical mind is the exercise of Nous when directed toward understanding the first causes and principles of being as being. The theoretician explains the order of the universe and the powers of the human soul that have evolved as a response to that universe. Aristotle's claim, all human beings by nature seek understanding, is a description of our natural destiny. We are the creatures that evolved a brain with the capacity to understand in a universe that is understandable. I've argued extensively elsewhere that Laszlo's description of systems thinking is compatible with Aristotle's view. After Aristotle, the history of Western thought can be understood as a reaction to or interpretation of the Greeks. These reactions tended to focus upon the acceptance or rejection of Nous, practical or theoretical or both. To mention only a few, the Neoplatonists, the Romans, the Stoics, Augustine, Aquinas, Avicenna, and numerous Renaissance thinkers tried to adapt positions from ancient Greek civilization into their own efforts to mold their cultures, to give advice about the education of future rulers, to counsel the rulers, to engage in exploration of the natural world, and to come up with a comprehensive worldview. The birth of modern science and the Western Enlightenment led to the rejection of the Greek worldview, with a focus on divine Nous and human Nous. Modern intellectuals of all types, including empiricists, rationalists, romantics, rejected the existence or value of Nous, divine and human. In ethics, human Nous was eliminated as the foundation for a good life and replaced with something else, such as the principle of utility or the categorical imperative. Intellectuals, both Christian and non-Christian, rejected tragedy. Christians thought Christ had redeemed the world and changed the course of history, so tragedy was a thing of the past. Believing in Christ and acting on one's belief was good enough for salvation, apart from the effect of one's choices in this world. For Kantian, the good will is the highest moral good, without regard for the consequences of one's actions. For the empiricist, the goal was sufficient scientific and social scientific data, combined with social engineering, so that people were conditioned to be virtuous. In politics, a focus on equality, freedom, and human rights they believed would inevitably lead toward a higher and higher quality of life. In the sciences, the use of knowledge to gain power over nature and use technology to improve the material conditions of life would supposedly lead to higher and higher levels of flourishing. Such a view inevitably rejects the ultimate goal in life as understanding the world, because the goal is to change the natural world in ways that lead to human well-being. On such a view, there is no correspondence between the powers of the human soul and the universe it observes, because the point of all observations is to change what one is observing according to a vision of a better future for human beings. The emphasis was on new knowledge, new ways of understanding nature, and new ways of exploiting natural resources for human well-being. Francis Bacon's famous New Organon is clearly a rejection of Aristotle's Old Organon, and the point of it is the purpose of knowledge is power over nature. He says so. This is not problematic or not disputed. The 20th century led to the rejection of the Enlightenment worldview. Laszlo discusses extensively how the mechanistic worldview has been replaced by systems thinking in all areas of human inquiry and action. The switch began not long after Einstein's theory of relativity was confirmed. At the time, researchers in many different fields were coming to the conclusion that the natural world functions holistically and that we have a power of soul that understands the universe as a whole and our place in it. The notion of Nous as the human power to grasp the whole was reintroduced. The image of the wise person as a microcosm in the macrocosm and the correspondence theory of truth re-emerged. One example is the work of Vladimir Vernadsky, a trained scientist whose studies of the physical world led him to draw conclusions about the relationship between the principles of the physical universe, the biosphere, and the evolution of human noosphere. Irina Trubetskova relates in her article that as early as 1926, Vernadsky's book, Biosphera, said, quote, "Cosmic energy determines the pressure of life that can be regarded as the transmission of solar energy to the Earth's surfaces. Activated by radiation, the matter of the biosphere collects and redistributes solar energy and converts it ultimately into free energy capable of doing work on Earth. In its life, its death, and its decomposition, an organism circulates its atoms through the biosphere over and over again." Vernadsky's 1944 book, The Biosphere and the Noosphere, he claims that we live in a transition to the noosphere. The historical origin of one community of intellectuals developed the notion of the noosphere. Quote, "The term noosphere was first coined by the French mathematician and philosopher, Mr. Leroy." Well, it wasn't first coined, I'm sorry, but okay. Leroy, building on Vernadsky's ideas and on discussions with Teilhard de Chardin, came up with the term noosphere, which he introduced in his lectures at the College in France in 1927. Both Chardin and Leroy attended Vernadsky's lectures at the Sorbonne in 1922 and 23. Vernadsky saw the concept of a noosphere as a natural extension of his own ideas, predating Leroy's choice of the term. Leroy understood the noosphere as a shell of the earth, or a thinking stratum, including various components, such as industry, language, and other forms of rational activity. Leroy's concept was developed by Teilhard de Chardin, who considered the noosphere as something external to the biosphere, a progression from biological to psychological and spiritual evolution. Vernadsky developed his concept of the noosphere out of his theory of the biosphere, combining his biogeochemical works with his own work in philosophy of science. The divergence is perhaps best expressed as an opposition between the anthropocentric view of life and the biocentric view of nature's economy, unquote. At approximately the same time, I will mention that when I was in 10th grade, I read Teilhard de Chardin, and I thought about this new sphere, and I remember thinking really hard about it and feeling like the chair I was sitting on was levitating off the ground. But many, many years later, we're back there. At approximately the same time, Alfred North Whitehead constructed a worldview, process philosophy, to explain the philosophical implications of relativity physics for the nature of reality as a whole. Whitehead's view is a modified version of Aristotle's final causes. Quote, this is what Whitehead says. The extreme rejection of final causation from our categories of explanation has been fallacious. A satisfactory cosmology must explain the interweaving of efficient and of final causation. The two spheres of operation should be interwoven and required, each by the other, unquote. And I want to say here that if Aristotle were alive, he would be very much on board and in the conversation. We don't need to quote Aristotle from what he said and say, well, he wouldn't agree with Whitehead. It's obvious that if he were alive and well today, he would be very much part of this community. Whitehead distinguishes between two very different powers of the human soul, both called reason. Quote, speculative reason is the human capacity to create a holistic theory of everything. The function of speculative reason is to constitute, emphasize, and criticize the final causes and strength of aims directed toward them, unquote. The sciences, by contrast, use a different power of the rational soul. Quote, the short-range function of reason is reason criticizing and emphasizing the subordinate purposes in nature, which are the agents of final causation. This is reason as pragmatic agent, unquote. Whitehead rejects empiricism, Cartesian dualism, Kant, and positivism. Quote, the triumph of the Newtonian physics settled science upon a dogmatic foundation of materialistic ideas which lasted for 2 centuries. If scientific materialism be the last word, metaphysics must be useless for physical science. The ultimate truths about nature are then not capable of any explanatory interpretation. Cartesian dualism, whereby the final actualities were divided into bodies and minds, and the Newtonian materialistic cosmology, combined to set a false goal before philosophic speculation. The notion of mere bodies and of mere minds was accepted uncritically. The most important effect on the relations of philosophy to natural science was produced by Kant. The effect of his critique of pure reason was to reduce the system of nature to mere appearance. In the long run, the effect of the Kantian point of view was to degrade science to the consideration of derivative details. Kant drove a wedge between science and speculative reason. Positivism holds that we are certainly in the world, and it also holds with Kant that the system of the world reflects no light upon metaphysics. This antagonism between philosophy and natural science has produced unfortunate limitations of thought on both sides, unquote. Whitehead reintroduces speculative reason, Nous, as the intellectual capacity to understand what relativity physics implies about the nature of reality. Quote, the real importance of the Greeks for the progress of the world is that they discovered the almost incredible secret that speculative reason was itself subject to orderly method. This is why we now speak of the speculative reason in the place of inspiration, unquote. Like systems thinkers, Whitehead was not against religion as such. He was critical of narrow-minded, exclusive, and dogma-driven religious traditions and convictions. Since the 1920s, there has been a growing movement toward the integration of the basic insights of the world's wisdom traditions into the new model of the natural world. This is the activity of forming a global noosphere. At the World Congress of Philosophy in Athens in 2013, thousands of scholars from around the world came together to present ideas from many different traditions. To give one example, the Society for Neo-Aristotelian Studies, founded in the Russian Republic, had multiple sections that included papers on Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, physics, and mathematics. Aristotle served as the common ground, and Nous is Aristotle's foundation, so I would argue that Nous is the power that unites these traditions, whether or not the papers explicitly made that connection. One possible obstacle to a unified worldview today is the literal interpretation of any of the three religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. When taken literally, a personal God has a specific plan for all of human history that begins with Abraham and includes only those who come from a certain bloodline or who have converted to one of these religions. The three traditions compete against each other, claiming that only one has the ultimate truth. If taken literally, there's no way to avoid wars and animosity based on ideas of God. Once again, Aristotle has served as the bridge between these religious traditions. Beginning about 40 years after Muhammad died, one of his descendants formed a community in southern Spain, Andalusia, that was dedicated to promoting intellectual dialogue and goodwill between adherents of these traditions. Scholars recognize that Aristotle's virtues and vices and his understanding of Nous, both divine and human, provided a solid foundation for their religious traditions and for building a bridge between those traditions. And one of my videos is going to be a summary of the history of that community. Another great barrier between ancients and moderns has been the view of the human psyche and its immortality. Plato's Phaedo discusses these issues and contains 6 different arguments, each focused on a power of the human soul and what that power implies for the soul's immortality. The arguments reflect positions still popular today. I'd call them the ecologist's argument, the biologist's argument, the chemist's argument, the mathematician's argument, the theologian's argument, and finally the argument Socrates takes most seriously, the argument from the power of Nous in the human soul and in the universe. Socrates says explicitly that his entire life has been guided by his Nous. He describes the universe as governed by the power of divine mind. The wise person is a microcosm in the macrocosm. What matters most to Socrates is that he has lived the best human life on earth. Both in the Phaedo and in the Apology, Socrates does not claim to know or care about whether his soul will live on after his body dies. Aristotle has a very complex, holistic, and systematic view of the human soul. As with Plato, his view assumes and describes an intricate correspondence between the way of life of a wise person and the universe within which he lives, both natural and cultural. The wise person is a microcosm in the macrocosm, with the power of Nous by nature governing all other knowledge and choices. In the De Anima, Aristotle starts from the most basic powers of soul, the 5 senses, and then describes each of the other powers as they emerge, each accounting for more of reality than the previously evolved and activated powers. The list of powers is long and involves 2 sources of activity simultaneously. At one level is appetite and desire in general, the experience of pleasure and pain, fear, and other basic drives. At the other level is how we interact with and understand our experience of the outside world, beginning with sensation, then perception, memory, imagination, experience, art, science, judgment, choice, and other powers. Aristotle's Ethics contains another list of the human powers of soul, the virtues and vices. This list includes all the ways desire leads to an image and an argument about what is worth living for, what way of life is best, and why the desire to understand is natural and necessary for us. After exercising all the other powers of soul in relation to some aspect of nature and culture, the thinking person begins to reflect on herself, becoming conscious that she is thinking. Aristotle says, quote, When thought has become each thing in the way in which a person who actually knows is said to know, this happens when he's now able to exercise the power on his own initiative. Thought is then able to think itself. In the case of objects which involve no matter, what thinks and what is thought are identical, for speculative knowledge and its objects are identical. Something like justice. It's certainly justice is lived out in actions and things, but there has to be an idea there that motivates the action. Aristotle leaves open the possibility that the power of mind, thought thinking itself, could outlast the death of the body. Aristotle's view is holistic, comprehensive, and systematic. This view was completely rejected during the Enlightenment. During the 1920s, when Whitehead, Vernadsky, Desjardins, and others were developing a holistic approach to the universe and human culture, Carl Jung was developing a more holistic view of the human psyche and of the world's mythological traditions. Jung rejected the other Enlightenment positions, as well as Freud's view. Instead, Jung argued that human beings have evolved from animals, but will always have a primitive, dark side, which Jung calls the shadow. Our capacity for extremely primitive behavior is often repressed and unconscious. In order to become mature, the unconscious has to be made conscious and integrated into consciousness. Other deep drives, what Jung calls animus and anima, associated with male and female, also have to be integrated into consciousness and balanced. The mature person integrates sensation, thought, emotion, and the highest level of understanding, intuition, in all aspects of life. Jung calls the wise person individuated. Individuation is Jung's term for the final good, the summum bonum, in all of Jung's thought and work. Jung connects the individuation with the images of the wise person in the world's religions. Quote, "This would be the point of new equilibrium and new centering of the total personality. I could say the same thing in the words of St. Paul, 'Yet not I live, but Christ liveth in me.' Or I might invoke Lao Tzu and appropriate his concept of the Tao, the middle way and creative center of things. In all these the same thing is meant. I would add that the education of Nous in Greek myth, tragedy, Homer, Plato, and Aristotle is one version of Jung's understanding of the education necessary to achieve wisdom. I also wrote a book that compared Jung to Plato and showed that Socrates is the individuated person, and I'll have one video that summarizes that book. Jung began a new branch of psychology, archetypal psychology, which is flourishing today. Joseph Campbell popularized Jung's view, which always involves some degree of oversimplification, but which indicates the deeply rooted psychological needs this view addresses. Some women rejected what they see as a sexist bias in Jung's and Campbell's understanding of psychology. Jean Shindola Bolin, author and a former feminist Jungian therapist, says, quote, "The individuation journey, the psychological quest for wholeness, ends in a union of opposites, in the inner marriage of masculine and feminine aspects of the personality that can be symbolized by the Eastern image of yin and yang contained within a circle." Unquote. Bolin has joined with women around the world who are calling for a return to a goddess-centered culture. They are alarmed at our collective destruction of the natural world, our Enlightenment faith in the power of science to save us through the exploitation of nature and the development of new technologies. These women claim that a goddess-centered worldview is the best model of a wise person as a microcosm in the macrocosm. Dr. Carol Christ has moved from her training in Christian theology to a pre-Hellenic, goddess-centered view. Quote, "The goddess is a symbol of the life, death, and rebirth energy in nature and culture, in personal and communal life. The life-giving powers of the goddess in her creative aspect are not limited to physical birth, for the goddess is also seen as the creator of all the arts of civilization, including healing, writing, and the giving of just law. Women in the middle of life who are not physical mothers may give birth to poems, songs, and books, or nurture other women, men, and children. They too are incarnations of the goddess in her creative, life-giving aspect. At the end of life, women incarnate the crone aspect of the goddess, the wise old woman, the woman who knows from experience what life is all about. I would add that women may also give birth to laws and institutions and social movements and all sorts of things. In her book, Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, Starhawk says, "Goddess is the world, manifest in each of us. She can be known internally by each individual in all her magnificent diversity." Starhawk points out the link between witchcraft and archetypal psychology. Quote, "The interplay of forces in two basic modes, the holistic intuitive starlight mode of the right hemisphere and the unconscious, and the linear analytic conscious mode of the left hemisphere. Communication between conscious and unconscious, between talking self and younger self, and through the latter to the deep self, the spirit, depends on an openness to both modes of awareness. Verbal concepts must be translated into symbols and images. Unconscious images must be brought to the light of consciousness." Starhawk also connects the worldview of witchcraft to quantum physics. Quote, "All things are swirls of energy, vortexes of moving forces, currents in an ever-changing sea. Underlying the appearance of separateness, of fixed objects within a linear system of time, reality is a field of energies that congeal temporarily into forms. In time, all fixed things dissolve, only to coalesce again into new forms, new vehicles. This view corresponds to an amazing degree with the view of modern physics." Dr. Paul Davies, philosopher of theoretical physics, represents a movement in the cognitive sciences that leads to the replacement of Enlightenment views by a more holistic view. Quote, "The two-level or multi-level description of mind and body is a great improvement on the old idea of dualism, mind and body as two distinct substances, or materialism, that mind doesn't exist. It is a philosophy that is rapidly gaining ground with the emergence of what are known as the cognitive sciences, artificial intelligence, computing science, linguistics, cybernetics, and psychology. All these fields of inquiry are concerned with systems that produce information in one way or another, whether man or machine. The philosophy of mind associated with the cognitive sciences is called functionalism." Quote, "Functionalists recognize that the essential ingredient of mind is not the hardware, the stuff your brain is made of, or the physical processes that it employs, but the software, the organization of the stuff, or the program. Thoughts cause thoughts, notwithstanding the fact that, at the hardware level, the causal links are already forged. At the highest level of thoughts causing thoughts, Davis sounds much like Aristotle. Quote, "Consciousness does not consist of awareness, but of self-awareness. We know that we know. The quality of self-reference is a key one in unraveling the mystery of the mind. There seems to be a natural progression from the inanimate through the animate to the conscious, a hierarchy of complexity and self-organization. But there's another hierarchy buried in this progression, a hierarchy of conceptual levels. The property of self-awareness is holistic and cannot be traced to specific electrochemical mechanisms in the brain." Unquote. At this level of self-awareness, again following Aristotle, human beings become conscious of themselves as knowers. Quote, "Consciousness, the impression of free will, and the sense of personal identity all involve an element of self-reference. During introspection, an observer observing himself, both subject and object coincide. Davies even leaves open the possibility of the immortality of the soul, as Aristotle does. Unfortunately, Davies and cognitive sciences in general leave out the connection between the mind and the natural world within which it emerges. No microcosm in the macrocosm. He does not ask researchers in the cognitive sciences to emphasize the unity of culture with nature in their work. I would hope that in the future the cognitive sciences will unite with the wisdom traditions to promote the technological development of sustainable societies. In his book, Looking for Spinoza, Joy, Sorrow, and the Feeling Brain, Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist, connects his expertise in neuroscience with a theory of the best human life. Damasio begins by rejecting the blank slate view of the brain. Quote, "The brain does not begin its day as a tabula rasa. The brain is imbued at the start of life with knowledge regarding how the organism should be managed. First came the machinery for producing reactions to an object or event, the machinery of emotion. Second came the machinery for producing a brain map, and then a mental image, an idea, for the reactions and the resulting state of the organism, the machinery of feeling. Eventually, in a fruitful combination with past memories, imagination, and reasoning, feelings led to the emergence of foresight and the possibility of creating novel, non-stereotypical responses. Further, the notion of ideas is important. It opens the way for representing relationships and creating symbols. It opens a way for creating an idea of self." Unquote. Damasio also claims that, quote, "Many human beings require some clarity about the meaning of one's life. The yearning is a deep trait of the human mind. It is rooted in human brain design and the genetic pool that begets it." Unquote. This yearning leads to the quest for spiritual experiences, which, says Damasio, quote, "are biological processes of the highest level of complexity. I assimilate the notion of spiritual to an intense experience of harmony, to the sense that the organism is functioning with the greatest possible perfection. The experience unfolds in association with the desire to act toward others with kindness and generosity. The spiritual is an index of the organizing scheme behind a life that is well balanced, well tempered, and well intended. Spiritual experiences form the basis of an intuition of the life process. Spiritual experiences are humanly nourishing. We have the power to evoke spiritual experiences such as prayer and rituals, the contemplation of nature, the reflection on scientific discovery, and the experience of great art." Damasio agrees with Spinoza that there are two roads to salvation. Quote, "The accessible road requires a virtuous life in a virtuous civitas, obedient to the rules of a democratic state, and mindful of God's nature somewhat indirectly, with the help of some of the Bible's wisdom. The second road requires all that is needed by the first, and, in addition, intuitive access to understanding. Spinoza regards intuition as the most sophisticated means of achieving knowledge. But intuition occurs only after we accumulate knowledge and use reason to analyze it. Spinoza asks the individual to reflect on life, guided by knowledge and reason, in the perspective of eternity, of God or nature, rather than in the perspective of the individual's immortality." I will say that decades ago, Spinoza was one of my PhD exam subjects, and I liked him because I connected him to environmentalism and the union of culture and nature, and the notion of wisdom as a microcosm and the macrocosm, and the association of God with nature or the universe. Unlike the other intellectuals I've discussed, Damasio understands this philosophy as, quote, "compatible with the view of the universe that science has been constructing for the past 400 years." Unquote. Damasio believes that, quote, "science can be combined with the best of a humanist tradition to permit a new approach to human affairs and lead to human flourishing." He thinks that within the next 2 decades, perhaps sooner, the neurobiology of emotion and feelings will allow biomedical science to develop effective treatments for pain and depression. The novel theories will revolutionize mental health. Although Damasio understands, quote, the failure of past social engineering, he's optimistic. However, quote, but that's in the past. Now we are forewarned and entitled to a new beginning. I do not share Damasio's optimism. Instead, I fear a future of people obsessed with feeling, quote, joy, enriching corporations that sell feel-good medications, living environmentally destructive lives, being manipulated by politicians who gain power by telling them that God will save them, that someone else is to blame, that war is the answer, etc. Damasio does not insist that human flourishing has to be understood as wisdom, being a microcosm in the macrocosm. And just to say, my students are aware of this. I have a student who told me this week he knows a kid his age can go into some counselor's office or someone's office, say they feel weird, get some mood altering pills, and go sell them for $5 or $10. I just think Damasio is extremely naive about what's actually going to happen with these kind of drugs. But it just follows the old tradition of Enlightenment thinkers thinking that science and its products will save the world, and actually they don't, because they aren't linked to wisdom. And I will talk about that quite a bit when I talk about Delphi and oh my gosh, there's so much of the Greek literature, the Greek gods, the god Apollo, his place in relation to the others, that tell the story over and over again. Do not worship Apollo, the god of reason, without balancing him out with wisdom and all the other deities. And Mr. Damasio didn't get that message. He's just pretty obviously completely in love with Apollo and very blind to what else can happen. And this is a huge movement. Neuroscience is going to save us, and I really worry about it. Conclusion. I've linked a number of trends in cultural and intellectual life in the 21st century to the ancient view of wisdom, the exercise of practical and theoretical mind. There are many reasons to fear for our future, yet on this view our nature depends, that we try to unite nature and culture to become microcosms in the macrocosm, without any illusions about success, and without the option of choosing to be less than completely human. So, however dark it seems, we have a natural drive to desire wisdom, to desire to understand, and we all need to just continually pursue that desire, cultivate it in ourselves and in each other. And we need to make sure those Apollonian worshippers would just link Apollo to the other deities, to wisdom and truth and justice. Otherwise, it will get carried away just like Apollo did. So this is how I'm going to link. I include the Greek pantheon, the history of their culture, because in many ways they have lots of things to say, and they don't just focus on the good side. They mostly focus on the bad side, all the ways things can go wrong. And people like Damasio is clearly unaware of this, and he needs to know. He needs to understand.